27th annual Sundays at 2 program. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes here before we start our great program that we have planned for today, but certainly gives you credit where credit is due on the program itself. This program started 28 years ago, and it was started by a good friend of the library by the name of Gloria Wallace. Some of you may know her. And she put together a wonderful program, shepherded for many years, and then unfortunately passed away last year, but still doing the program going strong. So we did miss a year of COVID, and we did have to start late last year because of COVID, but this year we're right on schedule. So with our 6 programs. If you haven't gotten one already, please take a brochure. It lists the 6 dates for our session. We also have an adult winter reading program brochure. If you'd open it up to the middle, you will find pictures of speakers, descriptions, dates, whatever. So hopefully you'll join us for more than just this one. Remember, it's not 6 consecutive dates. It's 6 dates on Sundays through March. So that's what we have going. We have a great program. Yes?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. My friends are coming through the door.
Thanks, Irene. Thank you. We have more friends here. Okay, that's good. Anyway, 6 programs. One of the things that we try to do as a committee is we try to have a diversity of topics, diversity of speakers in so many ways. You know, next week, the next session that we have is February 5th with Bill Young and Carolyn Young of Irvington, who are going to talk about the Peace Corps as a second and third career and different angle to music, which we're going to have today. On February 26th, we have Ed Burton, who is a UVA, University of Virginia professor of economics. Where is the U.S. economy headed? The aftermath of pandemic economics. March 5, we have Carolyn Quinn from Duggan Farms, building community at Duggan Farms. So some of you may know her business. Technology on March 12th with Josh Shergan, electrifying the U.S. ground fleet industry, a foundation for America, and that includes, private and commercial vehicles throughout the country. And then finally, we end on March 19th with Julian Patterson, who, if you know about Compass and other in the coffee house and other businesses in town, community involvement and entrepreneurial perspective on the Northern Neck. That's a real wide range of stuff. So hopefully you'll come back and you'll enjoy it. Before I start, let me introduce you to the rest of our committee. We have Lucia Scholler, who's in the back. We have Sandy Toomey in the back, Sheila Stepko. And we have Pat Tracy, who I'm going to introduce in a moment, who's going to introduce the speaker, and then me, and then our wonderful library director, Alice Cooper. So with that, turn it over to you, and Pat, and we'll get started for the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's my honor today to introduce Dr. Joel Hoffman, who has received his PhD from the Juilliard School, spent 36 years as a professor of composition at University of Cincinnati, simultaneously spending 22 years at the school in, I'll get it right, I'm going to make sure I get it, China Conservatory of Music in Beijing. He's an award-winning composer, pianist, and teacher, and is going to give us some time this afternoon to get some insight as to what it's like to live all those 3 lifestyles all at the same time. Joel, thank you.
Just give me a moment to get this on. How's the sound? Is that okay? Okay, good. 2 things before I get to the PowerPoint. Number 1, it's a lousy day. On the other hand, it's a perfect day to be here, right? So what else are you going to do? The second thing is that Heidi and I came to this area in March of 2020. Partly, we had been living in Manhattan in New York City, and as you may remember, at that time, New York was really a very difficult place because of COVID. And so we came here partly for that reason and partly for family reasons, with the intention of staying for maybe a few weeks or maybe a month or 2 to ride out the storm. And here we are. almost more than 2.5 years later. And we just love being here. It's such a wonderful, wonderful area. There's so many great people and things to do. And although the lifestyle here is just a tiny little bit different from that of Manhattan, I have to say that the wonderful things here really outclass the wonderful things there, which is they're so different, but they're so wonderful. So that helps to explain something that Pat didn't say, which is why we're here. I did work for many years in Cincinnati, and much of that time I went to Beijing, to the China Conservatory, and I did a lot of teaching of teaching young composers and teaching analysis and music literature courses in both places. I'm done with the academic world now, but I'm still composing a lot, and I'm active as a pianist as well. So with that, let's go to the PowerPoint. What I want to talk about for the next hour, which will be followed by some questions if you have some, is the whole process of composing. What is it? You know, sometimes I happen to be in a conversation with people and I say things like, classical music is on the margin of culture in this country. Well, to be a composer is to be on the margin of that margin. The magazine that the music entertainment industry uses, called Billboard, has a whole category, a set of categories of types of music, and Grammys are given out as a result of that. And you know, classical music until I think it was about 15 years ago was the smallest category of all of the various categories of music. And then about 15 years ago, it was removed because it became so small that now it's something like 2% of the whole music entertainment world, and it's just lumped in with some other things called other. And again, I'm on the margin of that. So, you know, it's not surprising that that compared to novelists or painters or sculptors or performance artists, people like me might be a little bit hard to figure out what we do and why we do it and how we do it. So that's the main thrust of what I want to talk with you about this afternoon for the next hour. And I hope that there will be some questions that come up. It's a big topic, in addition to being a kind of a secret topic. And I'm imagining that it will generate some questions for you. And I hope we have enough time to cover all of that. So I've just written down a kind of a table of contents of what I'm going to talk about here. And good pieces of music, whether they are a musical theater song or a rap song or a piece of so-called classical music, this is such a small category of work that I do that we don't even have a word for what I do. Some people call it contemporary classical composition, which is a rather ungainly mouthful, or new music composer. I prefer just to say that I write music. Anyhow, good pieces, no matter what genre they're in, have a focus, they have a concept. There's a driving through idea that informs all the details of a piece, no matter how long, how short, how approachable, accessible to an audience, or how obscure, whether it lives primarily in the academic environment or in the top 40. Good pieces of music have a thing that's recognizable, a thing that you can grasp. So how do we get that? How do we get there? Well, there's the idea stage in which we're looking for a concept. I didn't get born with 95 great ideas, and then it took the rest of my life to find the time to write them all down. No, I'm always looking, and I don't even know what I'm looking for a lot of the time. Casting around for memorable sounds. How does this idea become embodied with sound? And how do I even find it? Do I play it on the piano and say, oh, that's no good. Oh, that's good. I'll take that one. Or do I bang a piece of wood? Or do I ring a bell? Or do I just think about it while I'm in that crazy twilight zone between being awake and being asleep? The answer is all of the above, and a lot more too. Beginning to fit the concept to the sounds. I think that's self-explanatory. Accepting the inevitable unforeseen possibilities, because if I'm just like this all the time, and I say, okay, I'm not doing anything but what I told myself I was going to do last Thursday, then I may be missing out on all kinds of wonderful things that only come up in the course of doing, of working it out. Sketching and discarding. The act of writing, the act of playing on the piano, is the act of self-criticism and in the beginning of insight. Finding a place to begin with confidence. I think that if I could line up 9 of my composer friends plus me, all 10 of us would say, we never start a piece at the beginning. We start where we know what we're doing. And often that's nowhere near the beginning. It may be the end, it may be 9/19ths of the way through. It doesn't matter. We start where there's confidence, not at the beginning. And we don't necessarily end at the end either. A wonderful composer who died a couple of years ago was asked, I think, an incredibly insightful question. How do you know when you're finished a piece? And he said, when I know that I can't do any more damage to it. All right, keeping the concept clear so it can challenge the details, and equally allowing the details to challenge the concept, which is just a more flowery way of saying, again, self-criticism. Does this note really belong? You get out. You don't belong in this piece. Or come on in. It's great. You know, I'm always doing this. I'm always asking myself, if a note in a piece doesn't really deserve to be there, then maybe it can go to another piece. And finally, verifying the final product and having the courage to revise. I'll get to that later. So let's begin, because my trade is sound. It's kind of silly for me to talk about all this without giving you some sound first so that you have some context for what I'm talking about. Let's begin by listening to 2 things. The first is a trailer for a CD by Trio Agora, which was produced in 2020. The trailer doesn't actually identify this, but the music in the trailer is mine, and it's the subject of today's presentation. The Trio Agora is a trio made up of clarinet and cello and piano, and they are based in Berlin, and it so happens that the cellist is my daughter, Natanya. So I'm going to, it's going to take a moment because there's an easy and a difficult way of doing this, and of course I always have to choose the difficult one. Let's see, there's the trailer. Oh good, it comes right up. And I'll make this big. Nope, not there. Sorry. I need to make it big. I think that makes it big. No, it doesn't. Well, I'm not going to worry about it.
What is identity? The places of our birth, of our memories, of our ancestors.
These are stories about history, about remembering. These stories about us.
The 5 works commissioned for this project reflect the heritage of a region that hosted many cultures, governments, religions, and languages.
So what you heard was excerpts of two movements from a four-movement work that I composed. That's the whole four-movement work is on the CD. And I'm going to focus in a moment on the first movement, but I wanted you to get at least a little taste of what the musicians look like and what they have to say about this project. It's called Connecting Identities, and well, I'll get to that with the next slide. Just a moment. Let's see, I need to open this up. Okay. So, the second sound bite I'd like you to hear is a not quite 3-minute work called Oshe Pati Martala, which is the first movement of an 18-minute, 4-movement piece from 2017 called A Yauga Yauga, which is one of the works on that CD for which you just saw the trailer. And Oshe Pati Martala is the specific piece around which today's presentation revolves. So what you're going to hear now is the actual CD recording, and it is ostensibly a video, and it's on YouTube if you would like to listen to it again. It's very easy to find, but there's no video. It's just I think it's just the cover of the CD. So it's just a thing to listen to, not to look at. So in 2016, the trio decided to create a CD and a touring program that goes with the CD. You know, rock groups always say this. They do a tour to sell the CD, and they make the CD to promote the tour. So that's what classical musicians do too. Which was centered on connecting identities within contemporary Lithuanian artistic landscapes. The clarinetist, Žilvinas, is Lithuanian, and the pianist, Robertas, is also Lithuanian. My daughter, Natanya, is distantly related to being Lithuanian because one of my grandparents was Lithuanian. So I'm sort of a tiny little bit of a sliver of Lithuanian, and Natanya's half of that. But she has spent a lot of time in Lithuania, has learned Lithuanian, and is very much part of the research that was done into this project. The trio chose 4 Lithuanian composers to write pieces, and then they also chose me and asked me to contribute a piece with the specific directive that I should connect my family heritage to some aspect of Lithuanian traditional culture. So I cast around a lot online and in various books, and I came up with something that I really didn't know anything at all about. I'd never even heard the name. And it's a genre of folk music called sutartinas. And sutartinas are really wonderful examples of Lithuanian folk art. What's really unique about them is that they are music, but they are also dance. I have a little video that I'd like to play for you in a moment, which unfortunately doesn't really demonstrate the full dance side of this kind of music. It's just a tiny little bit of it, but the music side is fully represented. And I listened to many of these pieces and ultimately chose 4 of them on which to build original compositions. So it's important to stress that these are not arrangements of these folk pieces that I found. They are original pieces based on material from them. And the one that you just heard, Oshe Parte Matala, is the first one. Motulamano, Sirtela, Izyoya Yoya Sodauto, and A Yaga Yaga. The title track is number 4. And all 4 of them are actually on YouTube. It's very easy to find. If you just look me up in Lithuania or something like that, you'll find it. So today, as I said before, we're going to focus on the first one. And here I'd like to play you a video. I don't think I need to play the whole thing because you'll get the idea after a minute or so, of a group of 4 women who are singing and, as I said, sort of dancing this piece. This is the source from which my piece, which you've already heard, comes. Make this bigger so you can see the whole thing there.
Dabar scenoje merginų vokalinis kvartetas Augustė Karaliūnaitė, Lina Burlegaitė, Vidmantė Startaitė, Vaida Punytė iš Ukmergės Antano Smetonos gimnazijos. Vadovė Jūratė Martinkutė, o šiaip pati Martala, autentiška lietuvių liaudies sutartinė. Pasiklausykite.
O šiaip pati Martala, linėlius pasėjo,
So you've heard about 2/3 of it, and I assure you the rest of it is just like this. Quiz number 1. What is, or at least what is one of the salient features of this, which is the same as my piece? What do you hear in this that you also heard in my piece? Exactly. You'll get your $100 later. No, actually, that's exactly right. It's just, it's obsessively repetitive. This is, and so is my piece. And that's actually not limited to this one. If I took the time to play you some of the original other original Sutartinas, you'd find that they're all like that. They're what we call canons or rounds, like Frère Jacques. And they usually have 3 parts or 4 parts. And they are actual conversations. They're in this particular case, they're arguing about wedding preparations. And as I said, the dance aspect of it is just hinted at here, but as you could see, they were kind of looking at each other while they were saying or singing the things that they were singing. But it's actually an argument, and in the full-blown version of this, they would be cavorting around the stage and acting out what they're talking about. I just couldn't find a video when I looked for this one that showed that clearly. So this was the best I could do. But the music is exactly the way it should be. And again, yeah, repetition is the key. So before we're finished, I'm going to play the recording of my piece again in light of some of the things that I've already said and I'm going to say, and I think you'll see where I went with the repetition. Repetition for me was that key. It was that driving idea that informs the whole thing. They're doing it, I do it, but I do it in different ways, and I explore it a lot more. I get into levels of repetition that this doesn't do. Which isn't to say that mine is better, it's just that I'm going in that direction much farther than they did. But this was my source. It's also the case that the melody, that's all there is in the original. And I elaborated on that, but I didn't really stray from it. It's just really those 2 phrases, the first one, the second one. No, not like that. Like that. Okay. So, how could I connect this traditional music to my own music? What are the commonalities? What are the differences? And how do I absorb it and make it my own? Well, of course, as you all know perfectly well, repetition is the key to a lot of music, and not just classical music. Repetition is everything in music. And the amazing thing about repetition in music is that it's just like repetition in speech. If I say something once, it has a certain meaning. If I say something once, it has a certain meaning. If I say something once, it has a certain meaning. Right? So there's always something more when something is repeated. Always. It shifts. The angle shifts. You see it from a different perspective. The additional context gives you some thoughts. And I was intrigued by these Sutartinas because there are these repetitions, but I thought, my God, I can go so much farther with this. I can repeat the repetitions. I can have 5-part canons. I can change keys. I can have slower and faster versions of it going on at the same time. It just gives me so much juice that I can play with. So I don't compose music that sounds like what those 4 women are singing. I have nothing against it, but that's not who I am. I'm interested in going down much more circuitous paths, and the ending is not necessarily certain. As I said, when you heard them singing, I skipped the last part because we're always watching the clock, but they just do it over and over again and they stop. And I don't know if you're a big pop music fan or not, but my big beef with pop music is that that's what pop music, unfortunately, is too much of the time. You get a groove, you go for 14 seconds, and then it's the same thing for the rest of it, right? Well, okay, that's great. It's great for millions and millions of people all around the world, but it's not enough for me. I need for it to go somewhere. I need for it to tell a story. I need there to be an apotheosis. I need there to be something happened, instead of just cool, cool again, cool again, cool again, double bar line, now give me $1 million. You know, that's not enough for me. So those are the differences. I need for it to go somewhere. And so how do I absorb this and make it my own? Well, the repetition is part of it, but also if you're familiar with the music theory words that we use when we describe intervals, like bom bom we call that a major second. Bom bom bom, we could say that's steps 1, 2, and 3 in a major scale. So the total distance between bom 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 is a major third. That's all there is in this melody. The total intervallic span is very compact, and that is something that I do a lot of in my music, whether it's based on Sutarpinas or anything else. I'm intrigued by the idea of starting off with very little and being pushed, challenged to do something with it. There's a story which probably isn't true, that some of the big sculptures that Michelangelo did, which are all about the same width and height, were sculpted from blocks of marble of identical size, and he is said to have said that he didn't know what each sculpture was going to be until he started chiseling away, and then the marble told him what it should be. You know, so it was a process of discovery without preconceptions. And that's the way I like to compose. I like to take this extremely narrow band of material that seems to want to yield next to nothing and chip away at it until something happens. So I started by transcribing the folk song into standard music notation, which, believe me, was not difficult because it's just the same thing over and over again. And so as I'm writing all of this down, I begin to discover what I can do with the material. In other words, I'm kind of chipping away at the marble. But during this process, I also start realizing that most, if not all, of my initial cool ideas are actually rubbish. And that's normal. That's normal. Conceiving something and imagining it in sound, and then actually making it into sound, is an extremely disconcerting process. It's disorienting because when you try to make it into sound, all kinds of things that you hadn't thought about enter into this process, and it distracts you, it makes you upset, and it forces you to just throw away. Around the year 2000, I wrote an opera, and that was also a point at which, I think for about maybe 4 or 5 years, music notation software was already in existence. You know, essentially the musical version of Microsoft Word. And my students were almost, not all, but most of them were already using it, and I felt like a dinosaur because I was still writing things down on paper. But when I started this opera in 2000, and I realized how many hundreds, actually thousands of pages of music I was going to be writing down, I said, good, this is the time for me to get with the program. And so I bought a software program called Sibelius, and it's 23 years later, and I think I've written like 5 notes on paper since then. It's completely changed my life. I think for the better, but anyhow, the point is that I don't have stacks of paper that I can't bear to throw away because I'm a hoarder. It's in my computer, and all I have to do is press delete and it's gone. So, and I do, because most of it really is rubbish. So I'm sketching ideas on my computer, looking for something that will gain traction, and most of what I write down looks promising, but as I said before, after a little reflection, I see that things are really going nowhere, and I throw almost all of it away. The good thing is that I've been composing since I was 6, and the good thing at this point in my life is I know that if I keep at it, something will happen sooner or later. when I was in my teens and into my, I think maybe all of my 20s, there were, I would say that 2 out of 3 pieces that I started, I never finished. Because I didn't know where I was going and I couldn't figure it out. But more or less around the time I was 30, I started realizing that I shouldn't start writing it down and I shouldn't start thinking of it as a real piece until I've done this very ugly job of throwing 98% of it away. And then what's left is really going to gain some traction that's going to be good. And I'll be able to finish the piece. And now every time I start a piece, I finish it. Because I don't actually start writing it down until I know just what I'm doing. The late 19th, early 20th century French composer Maurice Ravel was once asked, he was working on his G major piano concerto, and someone asked him, so how are you doing? How are you getting along with it? Are you making progress? He says, yes, I've got it all done except for the notes. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's how it is. That's really how it is. I don't write down the notes until I know what it's going to be. But it isn't that one day I wake up and I say, okay, now I know. It's this process of throwing away, doing this hard work of chiseling into the musical marble until I get something that just won't stay away. And it's calling me and saying, I am what you're looking for. But it takes time, and it takes patience. So I go through this process many times before, and I know that sooner or later, if I stay with it, something good will happen. But it will only happen after writing and then throwing away everything I can think of that seems promising, although sometimes I do get lucky and something good appears relatively quickly in the process. So at some point, ideas gain traction, but typically it's not going to be at the beginning of the piece. So that, the heading on top, finding a place to begin with confidence, I mentioned this a little while ago. It probably will be some grain of an idea that belongs somewhere in the middle of the piece. And here's where I have some confidence. So here's where I start writing down the piece for real. I begin to build outward, backwards from the middle and forwards to the end. I mentioned in 2000 I wrote an opera. It's a 2.5-hour long opera, so can you imagine with such an enormous expanse of time and also stuff going on stage and dozens and dozens of pages of libretto, where do I start? Well, it turns out that about 2/5 of the way through, there was a funny scene where 2 people are courting each other in the middle of a party. And they're both saying ridiculous and awkward things to each other. And somehow, the humor of that, I felt really good about. So I started writing the opera down about there, about 2/5 of the way through. And then I worked forwards to the end and backwards to the beginning. So as I compose with ever greater confidence, it's very easy to get distracted and go down what look to be fruitful but actually are irrelevant paths. I must keep the initial concept clear, as the heading says, clearly in my mind as I work, so that it can challenge all of the details to be consistent with that concept, but I must also be equally present to allowing these details to challenge the concept, because I may well have greater insight into the full meaning of the concept once I'm really inside it. Or to go back to the analogy with Michelangelo, once he's got, say, 1/4 of that marble sculpted away, he begins to see where he was actually going, and maybe some of the original chiseling motions will have to be, well, of course he can't put the marble back in, but what he might do is change it, because he realizes that in the context of where he's been going, he sees that his first efforts were perhaps on the right track, but somewhat misguided. So, and when I say details, I actually mean harmonies, rhythms, contrapuntal ideas, melodies, orchestration, all the stuff of music, all of the materials of music. Those are the details that I'm writing down, which are challenging that original concept, but the concept is also challenging them. So finally, I arrive at the first version of a complete piece, and I've learned from many years of experience that it's only a first version. Along the way of composing the piece, I've had many insights that will change what I think about the sections written earlier on. So I have to have the courage and patience to revise. The patience part is obvious, but maybe not the courage part. Courage because, in fact, nobody really cares except me if I have arrived at the very best realization of of the initial concept or not. It's a cruel reality. I don't know why this is, but writers have editors, but composers don't have editors. There's really no one on whom I can call and say, have a good look at this and tell me where I'm going wrong. Even really great musicians who have looked at initial sketches of pieces, they're just too polite. It's not that they don't know what they're talking about. They feel like they can't get into this because this is some sort of secret alchemy. Like composers are somehow in a different world and they don't respond to the same things that everybody else does. And well, of course they can make mistakes, but to actually say, no, that's a wrong note, somehow it's just not done. When I was a student at the Juilliard School, I had a great teacher who I'm going to be indebted to for the rest of my life. But he never questioned any of the notes that I wrote. Strangely, at the same time, there was another, my teacher, by the way, was Elliot Carter, who was one of the great American composers, and another very fine composer, about the same age, also a faculty at Juilliard School, was David Diamond. I spent so many late nights with some of my composer student colleagues in which some of them, who were students of David Diamond, complained because Diamond would take an eraser and erase some stuff in their music. This was still the days of writing with pencil. And they thought this was scandalous. How dare he change a note that I wrote? How dare he? I mean, when I look back at that now, and I ask myself, how dare they be so presumptuous to think that they know more than a composer who's been writing music for a generation before they were born? Not because he's famous, but because he's experienced and he knows what it means to have the courage to see that what you've done is rubbish. And I think that those composers probably got more out of those lessons than I got out of the ones with my teacher, even though I stand by what I said a moment ago. They discovered what it's like to be brutal. And it was difficult for them to have their teacher tell them that they were, not just, you might consider this, but no, you're wrong. That note is wrong. That chord is wrong. You don't know what you're doing. That's a great lesson. So many listeners are obviously not in a position to tell me how I could have realized the concept more effectively, not because listeners have any less insight than composers do, but just because they have one pass at it, or maybe two, or maybe five at the most. But in order to really get into this and be self-critical the way it needs to be done, you have to be fully in it. You have to live the thing the whole day for weeks and months. And then you're in a position to see what works and what doesn't. You can't listen to a piece 3 times and start thinking that way. So, it really is up to me. So, now that you've listened to the piece once, and heard the source from which it was derived, and heard something about how I put it together, let's listen once again to the finished product. And I'd like to say a few more things before we listen about the piece that you heard and that you're going to hear again. So the melodic material and the rhythmic material that you heard in the folk version with the 4 women singing is identical to the material that I used. It's in a different key, but that's just because they're singers and there are comfortable keys for them. And I was writing a piece for clarinet and cello and piano, and I have a much bigger range of what I can do in terms of harmony and in terms of the overall range of notes, which we call tessitura. And it just made sense for me to put that melody in a different key. So I want to mention a couple of other things besides that one feature of repetition. In the original Sutartinas folk version, it's continuous singer 1 sings, and then halfway through what she does, singer 2 comes in, and then halfway through what she does, singer 3 comes in, and halfway through what she does, singer 4 comes in, and then halfway through what she does, singer 1 comes in, and it just continues like a patchwork, a sound patchwork or a time patchwork, until somebody decides that they're done. It's really that simple. There's no score, there's no written music. They know what the words are, they know what the melody is, and then they just do it. And I'm guessing that before they went on the stage on that TV program, they decided we're going to do it 5 times, or whatever it is. Because there's no beginning and there's no end. There's no story, except for the story of the words, which I don't speak Lithuanian, but I suspect that with the kind of contrapuntal jumble that they were creating, that maybe not everybody in the audience could understand the words either, even though I'm sure that everybody in that audience does speak Lithuanian. Or maybe they could grasp some of it, but maybe not all of it. But I'm writing a song without words. So the story that I tell has to make sense on another level. And that level has to do with repetition, contrast, and return once again, with the second contrasting section being somehow the result, or the logical or emotional repercussion of the first contrasting section. And the repetition sections cannot be identical to each other, because if they were, then what's the justification for it? I'm not just telling a story in words. I'm telling a story in music, which was the title of the whole lecture. Making a musical story through sound. And that means that there is a kind of sonic and emotional progression. If I were to ask myself, let alone ask you, to describe that progression in words, it would either be extremely difficult or impossible, because the language of music is its own language. We can't really, and sometimes people try to explain the emotions of a chord or a melody or a particular orchestration or even a whole piece. And for example, sometimes people say that major keys are happy and minor keys are sad. It's not that that's false. It's just that it's superficial. It can't really capture the whole thing. If I were to ask you if you happen to know, say, 5 novels by Philip Roth, and I name you 5 titles, and I say, what's the emotional essence of each of these novels? You could actually put this in words. And even if it were just 2 or 3 sentences, you could really grab the emotional center of each of those novels in words, because the art object itself is composed of words. But if I named you 5 pieces of Mozart that you happen to know, and I said, what's the emotional center of each of those pieces? I mean, maybe you could do it, but I know I couldn't. There's no way using words that I could grab what those pieces are really about, and more to the point, distinguish them from each other. Say the last 5 symphonies of Mozart. I know them all. I know them. I could almost play them. If there were a piano here, I could play them on the piano from beginning to end, each of them. But you ask me what they're about, I don't know what they're about. They're about them. They're about the music. It's about the sound. It's the musical journey expressed only through tones, not really describable in words, except on a somewhat superficial level. So it becomes difficult at this point if I'm going to tell you what the story is of my piece, except to say that there is one. And what I invite you to do when we listen again is to see if you can make some sense out of it, not as, oh, he used those melodies and rhythms from that folk version, isn't that nice? But rather, where is this piece going? How does it progress from the beginning to the end in a way that makes some kind of emotional sense? Even if you or I can't give it the embodiment of a word, or a phrase, or a sentence, or a paragraph, or even a color, or some other non-musical descriptor. I think it really defies that. Although, if you try and come up with it, and you can convince me I'm ready. Okay, so let's listen one more time. Couple things before we go to the last slide. This is the first of 4 movements, and the other movements are also sutartines, and therefore repetition is also the focal point of those pieces. So one of my challenges, obviously, was I can't use repetition as a starting point the same way in 4 movements, because then how do I justify 3 other iterations of the same concept? I'd love to play the other 3, but we don't have time for that. But if you're interested in seeing what I did with that problem, as I said, this is all on YouTube, you can easily find it. That's one thing. The other thing that I wanted to say is that what I have that 4 female voices don't have is I have, as I mentioned before, an enormous range of not just notes, but qualities of notes, because I have 3 very, very different instruments. The piano, of course, goes from very low to very high. The clarinet is a mid-range to high instrument. The cello is a low to mid-range and even up to a point high-range instrument as well. So I have 3 overlapping registral sets or registral collections. And then, of course, there's the completely different type of sound production. The piano is hammer striking strings, which can be sustained. The cello is playing strings with a bow. usually just one at a time, sometimes two or even three, and the clarinet is strictly one note at a time, but it's a wind instrument, so the whole method of sound production is quite different from the cello. So even though I am repeating relentlessly this material by alternating the timbres of the clarinet, the cello, and the piano, I already have contrast, I have variety, and because of that variety, I have something to build on, something to take to another place. The first contrasting section in this piece that you heard, the most salient characteristic of that, as opposed to the opening section, is that I completely open up the lower range of notes. The cello goes down, the piano goes down, the clarinet goes down as far as it can go, which isn't too far, but it's quite different from that mid-range to high-range bandwidth with which I begin the piece. So for contrast as well as development, I have at my disposal timbre varieties, register varieties, and multiple note varieties. That is, in the piano you could play maybe even as many as 10 notes at a time. Clarinet just one, the cello, as I said, 1, 2, or occasionally 3. And these are resources, of course, that 4 singers don't have. Okay, let's go to the last slide. I think this is the last slide. Just a moment. Yeah, so mostly this is just a prompt for questions because we're just about at 3 o'clock now. Did this explanation about the creative process in this instance change any previous thoughts you had about how composers and other artists work? And then I was sent, Pat Tracy sent me a list of potential questions that somebody might be interested in asking me about conductors, because I work with conductors a lot. But this is a work of non-conducted chamber music. Many of my other works are for orchestra or other large conducted ensembles. Maybe you'd like to discuss the ways in which conductors and composers interact. It's not really that different than composers and individual musicians in chamber music settings like this one, but there are some differences. And then the next one, would you be interested in knowing how composers get started in general and specifically in my case? And then last, because I do have this other life in China, which sadly and unfortunately has come to an end, for sure temporarily and maybe permanently, starting with reasons having to do with the pandemic, but continuing because of strained relationships between the governments of the two countries. And I was not renewed this past fall after 20 years for reasons that were quite murky. And so if I tell you the reason that I wasn't renewed, I'm really guessing, but I think I know. And it's not because I wasn't doing a good job. It had more to do with the fact of what my passport is. So these are just prompts. What would you like to talk about? I'll turn the lights on now so that we can all see each other better. Sorry, I should have warned you.
Yeah, I've got a simple question. Listening to, can you hear me? Listening to the rhythmic pulse, I don't know, 4 bars, 8 bars, however long it went, and then watching the video of the 4 singers, what caught me was not the words they were using, but it was the beat and where the beat arrived and where it came from. To me, it immediately occurred to me that this is something people have been doing for 300 years, planting crops, harvesting crops, thrashing grain, they're keeping up a melody, and as it would change, they're finishing with a sheave of wheat, setting it aside where the next lady comes in and starts beating the weed again. So do you envisage things like this when you're writing these sorts of pieces?
The reason that I think that's a great question is because it points out quite dramatically the difference between how music arises in the first place and how it's practiced by people who don't call themselves music professionals, and how that transitions into what people like what I do. Because no, such thoughts would never enter my mind. And the reason they don't is because it's almost like, this might seem like a strange analogy, but let's say that I'm a painter and I come to the Northern Neck for the first time and I see this glorious creek with egrets and ospreys and all this other stuff, and all the subtlety of color, the blues, the greens, the grays, and all that, but I'm colorblind. What do I do? And actually I am sort of colorblind, so this is a problem that I know firsthand. But I'm a painter. Well, obviously I respond to the things that I have the ability to respond to. So I'm missing a lot of stuff, but nevertheless there's a lot of stuff there that means something to me. I never thought of those four women doing something, the source of which goes back maybe even 1,000 years, or maybe even more than that, in a physical activity, and it was just a way of staying focused on the activity, a work song. You didn't say it that way, but I guess that's what you meant. And of course, that's what it is, and it evolves in all kinds of ways. But then when the likes of me get to it, I'm taking it to a very different place. I'm literally hijacking that material, and I want to do something very different with it. And if I were a somewhat colorblind painter trying to capture that creek somewhere around here, the things that would mean something to me might be very, very different from what a normal color-seeing person would experience. But if I'm really good at what I'm doing, what I do might be really revealing, even to someone who sees all the colors, because I'm strangely focused on only a certain part of it. But then I take that part and I turn it into a whole world unto itself. And that's what I've done with these pieces. I'm not trying to reconstruct or relive or somehow comment on or give my perspective on what, I think you're absolutely right, what must have originally been a work song, and say what I have to say about it. No, I've just transplanted it into a different thing. But again, this is a very, very interesting question because, for example, the composer Gustav Mahler apparently wrote, maybe not all of his symphonies, but many of them he wrote in a little cabin in the mountains in I forget whether it was extreme northern Italy or extreme southern Austria, but somewhere in the Dolomite Mountains. Actually, it's Italy. I've been there. It's called Dobbiaco, or Toblach in German. And it is just barely inside the Italian border. And, people who know about where Mahler composed his music talk endlessly about how the music describes this landscape that he was there in the middle of. Is that correct? I don't know. I mean, certainly he must have enjoyed being where he was, but did that really give him ideas for melodies and rhythms and harmonies? Probably not. On the other hand, Mahler died, I think, at the age of 50, and he had a heart condition, and he was obsessed about his heartbeat. And the heartbeat, that sound, shows up all over the place in Mahler's music. So that's a very, very specific reference. I don't think it's a stretch to say that obsession about his health found its way into his symphonies. But to say that the incredible landscape of where he was in this mountain cabin, many years ago, and I think it was the first time I ever came to Virginia, I went to Manassas in Northern Virginia. There was an orchestra that existed for about 35 years called the Prince William Symphony. And many of the people in the orchestra were members of the service bands and orchestras. The conductor was the principal clarinetist, I think, of the Air Force Band. They've since disbanded. I think they were a victim of the pandemic. In any case, they had a competition shortly before their 30th anniversary, and they wanted a composer to come in and write a piece that would commemorate the 30th anniversary. Well, I entered it and I won, so I went there. And before I wrote the piece for them, I was invited to show up and listen to the orchestra play a concert, and also a retired general drove me pretty much around the entire county, Prince William County, which is an amazing county if you know it, because it's got mountains, it's got ocean, it's got everything in between. And then there's this city of Manassas, which has this war museum. And inside you see all this incredibly brutal stuff about the Civil War, about the Revolutionary War. And I'll get back to that in a moment. So that evening, I was totally worn out from driving all around Prince William County and walking everywhere. But that evening there was a concert, and the orchestra played, and they played beautifully. And there was a reception afterwards for the soloist and the conductor of the orchestra, and they also wanted to introduce me. So a bunch of people, mostly donors of the orchestra, came to this party, and they introduced me and said, well, this guy's going to write a piece that's celebrating our 30th anniversary. So then I said something which I later regretted, which is, okay, I just drove around the entire county today. It's a beautiful county. You're all very fortunate to live here. I don't know what this piece is going to be about yet. Anybody have any ideas? And then some guy stood up and said, the mountains, put the mountains in there. And then someone else, it was like that. And I thought, oh my God, I've unleashed a monster, because I don't know how to put mountains in a piece of music. It never occurred to me to try. That's not my stock in trade, right? So anyway, but there is something about Prince William County, this is what I was going to come back to, that is in that piece. And I think it's a very moving thing. In that museum, there was a glass case that had the usual stuff. It had helmets and uniforms and all the other stuff of war. And on the back wall of the case, there was a piece of music, just like that. And I thought, what's a piece of music doing in here? So I looked at it and I thought, oh, this is interesting. This is a song. It's a piece of music manuscript paper from Civil War time that's been preserved. Why is it there? And then there was just like in every museum, there was an explanatory panel underneath that said what that's about. And it said, well, one day in, and I don't remember the year or the month or the day, there was an encampment of Union soldiers here, and there was an encampment of Confederate soldiers there. And they were so close to each other that night that they could actually hear and see each other. But it was night, and they weren't going to be aggressive towards each other until the next day. And one of the Union soldiers started singing the song that's written in this manuscript. And then some other Union soldiers started singing it too. And the Confederate soldiers heard it. And they started singing it, but with different words. And they were across a river. They were singing to each other with their own stories. And then the next day, probably half of them died. I thought that was a remarkable thing. And so that melody is in that piece. And the name of that piece is To Listen, to Hear. So I told the story that I just told you about how I happened to come across this melody. I really went all over Prince William County, but that thing is what gave me, that was the source for that piece, that remarkable moment. So that I can do something with because it's music. And I have my own emotional ideas about what that moment in time in that place must have been like for those 45 young guys. That I can do something with. But the guy who said, yeah, put the mountains in there, that's beyond me. I can't do it.
What was the name of the piece?
It's called To Listen, to Hear. Oh, you mean the original, the song.
Yeah, but
The piece that I composed is called To Listen, to Hear. I don't remember the name of the original song. But if you go to the Manassas Museum, I assume it's still there. I don't remember the words either, but I can sing you the melody. It sounds like a typical Civil War period American melody. Da 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 very authentic, right? And it had to be in my piece, and it's all over in my piece. Yeah. I kind of digress from your question, but yeah. Something else?
That sort of leads to my question is, how important is that original commission? The first thought? Or can you just lie around and think of some wonderful piece of music and then look for a commission?
So you're asking about how how professional opportunities line up with what I might have been working on anyway.
There you go.
Yeah, they don't line up at all. So when I was very young, like up until high school, nobody, of course, asked me to write any music. So everything that I did was either something that I just dreamed up, or it was something that a teacher told me I should do in order to get better at what I was doing. Like, now you're going to write a fugue, or now you're going to write a piano sonata. But eventually, actually the very first commission that I got, I was still a student. And even though it was the first one that I got, it actually is quite emblematic of the answer to your question. So there was a group of 5 musicians who played in an orchestra, a very good professional orchestra, who played on a chamber music series made up of members of the orchestra. And it was an odd combination of instruments. It was so odd that there wasn't any music ever written for that particular combination of instruments. The individual ones, of course, millions of pieces, but that particular group of 5, they didn't have anything they could all play together. So they came to me and they said, would you write a piece for us? Well, of course I wasn't thinking of writing a piece for those 5 instruments, because nobody else ever had either. But it was $100, which in 1974 was not a small amount of money. Not to mention the fact that nobody had ever offered me a dime before for a piece. So was I going to turn it down? Of course not. I had no idea what to do. The only thing I knew was it's those instruments. I'm not even sure I can tell you. I know there was cello, bassoon, percussion, double bass, and something. I don't remember what the 5th one was. But it really was something for which there was no literature at all. And then this one in Prince William is another good example. I mean, how do I write a piece? Was I just looking around to write a piece for the Prince William Symphony? No, of course not. By the way, a sub-question inside of your question is, do composers... I think I'm doing that. You know what? I can speak loud. This is loud. Now I've lost my train of thought. Let's see. Yes. So sometimes there are competitions for composers, young composers or composers of any age, and often these competitions ask for very specific things. And the question is, do composers ever write a piece, entering it into a competition, hoping that it will win? Yes, sadly, there are composers who do that. I think it's a very, very poor idea. Because like any lottery, the greatest likelihood is that you won't win. And then you've written this piece that was purpose-built for some specific thing that will never, ever happen again in the universe. So, generally speaking, composers either write music because they have to, because of something inside, or because they've been asked to, whether they're paid or not. And by the way, another answer to a sub-question is it a commission if you don't get paid? And that's actually a debatable question, but where I come from, it's not. A commission is something that you get paid for. It's a professional job, like painting somebody's garage. And just like painting someone's garage, we agree on the price, we agree on when it will be done. And if I don't do that as a composer, then I haven't done my job. I don't fail to turn it in on time because, oh, I had some kind of artistic fit. No, it's just like painting a garage. I get it done because that's when it's supposed to be done. And I could name you, but I won't. Composers who have lost their careers because they couldn't finish pieces on time. Repetitively. They just couldn't do it. Why they couldn't is not relevant, but you know, it's a professional contract like anything else. But then there's the other side, which is, okay, I'm commissioned by an orchestra to write a piece. I turn it in on time. To the best of my knowledge, it's a good piece. There's no reason not to perform it. But the orchestra doesn't perform it. Why? It doesn't matter. If they don't perform it, then they're in breach of contract. And I have a right to sue, just like they have a right to sue me if I accept the money but I don't produce the piece. It's no more exotic than that. It's like any other professional contract. So it stands to reason that a commission is for a specific purpose. Typically, commissions are to celebrate the opening of a new concert hall, or because the conductor is 50 years old and wants to celebrate that with his or her orchestra, or some other reason. Or maybe there's a donor who wants to give money for a commission in order to highlight something that is important to that donor. You can ask the composer, and the composer can say no if he or she doesn't want to accept the commission. But if the composer accepts the commission, then you make something that was built for that purpose. It's really just that simple. I have turned down commissions before, but actually part of who I am as a composer is I really like the challenge of finding out what happens when I say yes, no matter what. Because it will, just like I was talking before on one of those slides, it will lead me in directions, it will challenge me in ways that can be artistically very gratifying. For example, I haven't talked at all about my Chinese life, but the first piece I wrote for Chinese instruments was a piece for 22 bamboo flutes. And I didn't know what to do, but I thought, if I do this, something's going to happen that's good. And I've written a whole bunch of pieces for Chinese instruments now because I said yes to that. And actually that piece was a disaster. And it was a disaster for a very, very specific reason. The traditional Chinese instruments were never intended when they were built, when they were conceived of, and when they're learned by musicians who play those instruments, they were never meant to be played together. They're solo instruments. If I had to say what the most common traditional use for those instruments would be, it is where you might have some people walking down a temple from one end to the other, playing instruments as part of some kind of event. But if you get, so you could have a bamboo flute player with a Chinese zither player, guzheng, or some other instruments. But if you have multiple bamboo flutes, they're not in tune with each other. If you get a bunch of Western flutes together, they're in tune. Which is why when you hear an orchestra and you see 3 flutists playing, it doesn't sound like this. They sound good because the instruments are standardized. But bamboo flutes, each one of them is made out of a piece of bamboo that's different from every other piece of bamboo. But I wrote a piece for 22 bamboo flutes, thinking, stupidly, that they would be in tune with each other. What I got was a calliope at a county fair. It was not what I composed. I wised up after that. Somehow, the guy who commissioned me liked the piece anyway, and in the meantime, he's asked me to write he's commissioned me, which means I've gotten paid, to write a number of other pieces for the same ensemble, the 22 bamboo flutes. But I figured out I need to live with this chaos, not fight against it. So the second piece I wrote for the Beijing Bamboo Flute Orchestra actually expects them not to be able to play in tune with each other. It, in fact, requires it. So in the rehearsals of the first piece, I was constantly telling them, no, go back to that, do it again. get yourselves in tune. In the second one, they were wondering, how come he's not criticizing our intonation? Because it's part of the piece. It's planned chaos instead of accidental chaos. Yep.
Today's program is your name, and then composer, pianist, or teacher.
Yes.
So as we leave, how would you?
I didn't get to 2/3 of.
How would you consider we should answer that question?
Sure. Well, not all composers are good teachers, and not all composers like to teach. But the harsh reality is that almost all composers find that teaching is the best way to earn a living, because composing does not earn a living. Yes, I do get commissions. Yes, I do get paid, but not enough to support even one person, let alone a family. So teaching is the natural consequence of that. I'm not going to say whether I'm a good teacher or not, but I do enjoy doing it, and I did it for a long time. Until August of last year, I never got fired, and I got fired for reasons which I think had nothing to do with my teaching. So there's a lot. There's a joke. Composers are generally a very dour lot, so there aren't too many composer jokes. But there are a few, and one of them goes like this. The question is, can composition be taught? And the answer is, composition cannot be taught, and composition should not be taught. You're supposed to laugh. The reason it's funny is because we have enough composers, we don't want any more. So in any case, but actually, you can teach composition. But those things that I put up there on my slides are the things that I talk to my students about. For example, don't take the first thing that you compose and think it's any good. Be self-critical. You'll come up with better stuff. So the teaching part is, it just flows smoothly from the things that one learns as a composer. Ironically, I started teaching composition literally the fall after I graduated from Juilliard. I graduated when I was 24, and I started teaching later that fall. And I'm very happy for the work, but I wasn't really ready to teach then, because I didn't have the experience that I have now. But if I hadn't started teaching until now, then I wouldn't have anything. So, okay. The piano part is, when I was a little kid, my whole family are musicians. My parents, my father was a wonderful conductor, my mother was a wonderful violinist. Their parents, on both sides, were all musicians. I have two brothers. One of them is a fabulous cellist, and the other is a conductor and a violist. My sister died a few years ago, but she was the principal harpist at the Metropolitan Opera in New York. My son is a violinist, a wonderful violinist. You heard my daughter, and so it goes. It's a family of musicians. And so when I was 3, I had to either choose the piano or the violin. I started in the violin, made the most horrifying sounds, and said, okay, I don't want that, and I chose the piano. But when I was about 15, I realized that the life of a concert pianist was not for me. Simply and frankly, I wasn't good enough. I just could not play the instrument well enough to be able to compete with people who were on the top level. And because I came from a family of people who were at the top level, it was pretty obvious to me that if I'm not there, what's the point? I didn't stop playing. In fact, I continue to play to this day. But I don't hit my head against the wall trying to compete with people who can do things that I cannot do. But the other thing that happened while I was a little kid playing the piano is that I loved to improvise. In fact, I really preferred to improvise compared to having to learn pieces by other composers. Sometimes I would be babysat. Do I say that? And I went over to a neighbor's house and played on their piano, and I was supposed to practice. So my parents would ask when they came back, did he practice? And they said, yes, of course he practiced. Well, I didn't practice. I was improvising the whole time. I was playing pieces in the style of Mozart and in the style of Beethoven, because that's what I like to do. And then in